Talking about these essential requirements for normal cell function, right? And so we care about these essential requirements for normal cell function because in the context of pathophysiology, they are targets for potential altered function and development of a disease process. Okay? So we talked last time, most recently, about the pH balance of the body, right? And we talked quite a lot about pH balance and understanding the respiratory versus metabolic causes of either acidosis or alkalosis, and then evaluating that. So the next topic is cell metabolism, and so much of this is a review, obviously. But with cell metabolism, we're talking about the ability of the cell to produce enough energy to do work. Okay? And so the cell takes energy substrate, okay, in the form of ingested nutrients. Okay? It takes energy substrate in the form of nutritional intake, whether it be proteins that then are absorbed in the form of amino acids, polysaccharides that are absorbed in the form of monosaccharides, including which all get converted to glucose. Okay? All the different monosaccharides, in order to actually be used, they have to be first converted to glucose. And then nutritional intake in the form of fats, which are going to be absorbed in the form of free fatty acids and glycerol, right? And then this glycerol backbone that held together those free fatty acids are actually simply a form of glucose. So these energy substrates, these sources of energy substrate, they enter the metabolic pathways, or can enter the metabolic pathways, in different stages. And there are three basic stages of metabolism. The initial stage is concerned with the breakdown of glucose. Glycolysis is broken down into pyruvate, which is then converted to acetyl-CoA, enters the mitochondria, and enters the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. Okay. And then products of the citric acid cycle enter the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. Okay. And so these three levels of metabolism, glycolysis, Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and then electron transport chain or oxidative phosphorylation, these three stages yield different units of energy in the form of ATP. Okay. So this first stage, glycolysis, doesn't require oxygen, it's anaerobic, produces 2 ATP for every 1 unit of glucose. Okay. The products of the glycolysis stage enter the Krebs cycle. They yield, again, 2 ATP for every 1 glucose, and then the products of the Krebs cycle enter the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation and yield 32 ATP per 1 glucose. Okay. So the first stage, glycolysis and Krebs cycle, what's important to point out, number one, glycolysis happens in the cytosol. Number two, Krebs cycle happens within the mitochondria. But both processes are anaerobic. They don't consume oxygen. Okay. This last stage, the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation, is the only step in metabolism that actually consumes oxygen. It consumes oxygen and it produces carbon dioxide. Now, it also happens to be the stage of metabolism that produces the greatest yield of ATP. Okay. And this is, by the way, the only role for oxygen in the body. This is why we need oxygen, is to carry out this last step of metabolism and produce this nice, huge yield of ATP. Okay. And so we're going to talk about in not too long, in some sources of cell injury And one of the most common sources of cell injury is hypoxic injury, where oxygen delivery to tissue is impaired. And so immediately you know that if oxygen delivery of tissue is impaired, then the ability to produce ATP is impaired. And the cell has sort of an energy crisis. And much of the events that come out of that are a consequence of this energy crisis. Okay. Cells have to control cell transport. Okay. And I'm not going to go over these mechanisms of cell transport because we talked about them ad nauseum last semester. If you need a review of them, I recommend that you go back and sort of review them on your own. But controlling of cell transport includes passive transport, active transport, and obviously for the passive transport, this kind of transport is going to happen one way or another, but for this active transport, it's going to rely on the cell's source of energy, right? And so if a cell is in a state of energy crisis, obviously its ability to carry out active transport is impaired, and there's lots of consequences to that. So if you feel like you need a refresher for these mechanisms, please go back and look over your notes from last semester. So we have all of these requirements for essential cell function, which, as I said, are sources for potential disturbance and potential sources of cell injury. Now, the development of a disease state always involves some sort of introduction of an altered function or some sort of injury. And the injury alters function at the cellular level. Okay? So the function of the cell or the malfunction of the cell is really the basis for the development of all disease states. Now, when we talk about cell injury, cell injury comes from agents that cause injury or simply high stress situations. Okay? So cells can be exposed to some form of stress, okay? And the stress might be in the form of increased functional demand. Okay? They're just being required to function at a very high intensity, or the stress might be some sort of deprivation of oxygen delivery, some sort of deprivation of nutrient delivery. Okay? Some sort of stressor is being placed on the cell. Now, how a cell responds depends on the intensity of that stress, the duration of that stress. Okay? And so it could be that this stressor is so severe that this cell is irreversibly injured and then dies. Okay? So irreversible cell injury leads to cell death. And this kind of unintended cell death or traumatic cell death we call coagulative necrosis. Okay? The generic term for a traumatic cell death is coagulative necrosis. So sometimes the stress is so severe it just causes a cell to be injured beyond repair and die. Sometimes the stress is so mild that the normal cell function just isn't impaired at all. And then more often, much more often, cells undergo sort of low-level stress over a prolonged period of time and adapt in some way. Okay? They somehow undergo some sort of adaptation, okay? Either to an increase in functional demand or some sort of cell injury that is reversible. And this adaptation that the cell undergoes allows it to maintain its stability and survival. Okay? It allows it to maintain its stability and survival, but it will often change how it functions. Okay? It will often change how the cell functions. And so if the cell is functioning, if the cell's function has changed, then the tissue function has changed, the organ function has changed, and then all of a sudden that's going to manifest somehow. It's going to create some particular set of signs and symptoms. Okay? And so we're going to talk about these different forms of cell adaptation. Okay? Many of these are really adaptations in the purest sense of the term. Hypertrophy, hyperplasia, atrophy, metaplasia, altered storage. Those are really adaptations in the truest sense of the form. And then this one called dysplasia is really not an adaptation so much as a real consequence of injury. Okay? It doesn't increase the cell's stability. It is really just the manifestation of cell injury that is not beneficial in any way. Okay? And we'll talk about that in a moment. But for all of these, or for most of these, when the stress is relieved, the cell can go back to a normal state. So these represent sort of reversible adaptations to prolonged stress or injury. Okay. So before we get into some of these adaptations, okay, what can cause them and what it looks like, let's talk about some mechanisms of cell injury. What are the more common ways that cells get injured? One of the most common ways a cell is injured is through hypoxic injury. Okay? So anything that limits or interrupts oxygen delivery to tissue is going to result in hypoxic injury. Okay? Oxygen deprivation of tissue. Now, the term ischemia, somebody raise their hand. What's the definition of ischemia? What is that? Somebody tell me. Any brave soul that wants to raise their hand and tell me what ischemia is? Yes, ma'am.
There's a blockage of blood through the vessels.
Yes. Ischemia does not mean that there is a full blockage of blood flow. Ischemia usually means there's some sort of diminished blood flow to the area. Okay. So ischemia is particularly talking about reduced blood flow. Okay. And since oxygen is delivered obviously through the circulatory system, ischemia is sort of ischemic conditions create hypoxia. Okay. But there's an important difference between hypoxia and ischemia. There are other causes of hypoxia besides ischemia. Okay. So diminished blood flow is a reason why you might have tissue that's hypoxic. What's another reason why you might have tissue that's hypoxic? Besides, let's say blood flow to the area is fine. Yes?
Low ventilation, therefore lower pressure.
Absolutely. Tissue can become hypoxic because you're not delivering blood, or the blood is not as oxygenated as it should be, right? And the blood oxygenation can go down because of some ventilation problem, because of a gas exchange problem, because of some anemic situation where red blood cell count or hemoglobin quality has gone down. Okay? So hypoxia can come about from a variety of reasons, and it's important to understand that there's not just one reason for hypoxia to occur. But ischemia is a really, really important mechanism. And most of what we understand about the details of hypoxic injury to tissue comes from studies of ischemia, which come from heart disease, comes from coronary artery disease, and looking at the pathogenesis of cardiac ischemia. Okay? So that's really been the model for understanding hypoxic injury, and we'll look at sort of the mechanism of that in a minute. Anoxia refers to a complete and total interruption of oxygen delivery. Okay? A complete and total interruption of oxygen delivery. And anoxia may be a result of obstructed blood flow, okay, completely obstructed blood flow. And an obstruction of blood flow often precedes what's called tissue infarction. And tissue infarction is the death of tissue, usually as a result of some cessation of blood flow to the area. Okay. And so infarction is often used in reference to cardiac infarction, so myocardial infarction, but you can also have infarction of other tissue. But it's because of a cessation of blood flow to that area that created an anoxic injury and then death of cells. Okay. Now, there's also, interestingly, an injury that is associated with, oftentimes, or can be associated with reperfusion of an area. So when there's, for example, an ischemia or a cessation of blood flow to an area, and the tissue has become hypoxic, actually reperfusing the tissue can cause injury in and of itself. And so in order for me to fully explain that, I have to talk about the next topic, okay, which is the next mechanism for cell injury. And that's tissue injury